Hello friends, my name is Bintou and welcome back to my channel. So today's video is going to be a read along or read with me as I read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. So actually this is kind of going to be the start of a new series. I find that I really enjoy these videos where I spend the entire video going through a single book and updating it in certain intervals with my thoughts and predictions as I go through the book, and then my final thoughts and a review of the book at the end. I've been doing this for several books, but I've been calling them reading vlogs, but they're not really vlogs because I don't actually do anything except talk about the book. I have found that I really suck at picking up the camera, going through my daily life and actually recording. That part isn't really fun for me. So instead of calling them reading vlogs, I think I'm gonna call them part of this read with me series. And I know that videos on just single books probably aren't always going to do as well because you kind of have to have read the book. And that's why I try to stick to more popular books that more people will have read. Caste, I know, is pretty popular, and this has been on my TBR for a while. I got this book at the end of 2020, and I think as we are right now in February, Black History Month, perfect time to pick this up and get this book read. So I hope you enjoy watching me go through this book and discuss some of my thoughts on a lot of the points that she brings up. And definitely stay tuned to the end for my final thoughts on Caste. All right guys, so I'm checking in with my first update on Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and I've gotten through part 1 and part 2. There are a total of 7 parts, I believe, in this book. So I'm like about a fifth of the way through. And I've got a couple of notes that I jotted down that I wanted to share in this first update. First of all, this book is awesome. So I think I'm just gonna start off by getting that out of the way right off the bat. And I have been like annotating all over this thing. I think that there are so many good points that she brings up. And like literally right in the introduction, one of the things she touches on, and this is a question that I feel like at some point in our lives when we're learning about history, we may have all asked ourselves this, but she's like, we want to believe that we would take the more difficult path of standing up against injustice whenever we are kind of looking back on things. But she makes an excellent point that in order to be the person that stands up against injustice, you're pretty much going to be standing alone. And you would have to suffer the discomfort, the derision of your friends, your family, the neighbors. And so she makes a very good point, like how many of us would truly be willing to do that. And I think that's why we hold the heroes that we do in such high regards when we're talking about, say, the civil rights movement, like MLK or John Lewis, because deep down, I think many of us know how much strength it takes to be the person that stands against the crowd in that way. One of the next important things that is in this book that she talks about is the definition of caste, and how caste is basically a system that, first of all, has existed for a long time. Before racism became a thing, I guess, in the United States, you can say that casteism has existed long before that. And basically, it's a ranking of human values is how she describes it here, where there is some sort of superior group and then there is an inferior group. And there are arbitrary boundaries that we have given meaning to keep the groups apart. So we're thinking about race in the US, obviously that would be white versus black. And then she touches on the caste system in India, where it's the untouchables versus, I forget the very top caste, but there is clear delineation between the two groups. And if it might not be skin color, it could be things like the way that they carry themselves. And she mentions that in here as well. And of course, casteism and racism kind of go hand in hand. The difference being that racism, I guess, would be a kind of casteism in this case, where it is a very specific way of ranking based on skin color. And racism can change, whereas casteism is pretty constant in its definition of just separating groups of people by certain traits. Another important thing to consider that she touches on in this book is how racism kind of came to be here in the US when Africans were brought to America. Because it's true that, and we don't think about this, I guess, if you're very US centric, which I know that I tend to be at times, but black and white tend to exist in America. So like, white immigrants weren't white until they came here. And people aren't Black until they come here or to somewhere like Britain or Australia. But she mentions like there are literally no Black people in Africa. There are various tribal people that they'll identify themselves as maybe Yoruba or by country, so they could be Ghanaian, but they don't really become Black until they come into the US or the UK. And that's a very powerful statement, because I think that particularly us in the US, we tend to forget that. And quite possibly the funniest, and I say funniest ironically sort of, thing that stand out in these first two parts is the chapter on the Nazis. So she discusses how the Nazis were looking to the US as their model for how they were going to turn the Germans against the Jews. And they were poring over like US laws that existed at the time, particularly the Jim Crow laws. And they basically considered it kind of a masterpiece. And they incorporated a lot of those rules for turning Germans against the Jews. And the funniest again, is that even the Nazis considered some of the things that Americans did as going too far, right? And we hail the extermination of 6 million Jews as quite possibly one of the worst things to befall humanity. And yet they considered the one-drop rule to be going too far. The one-drop rule being, of course, if you have even a little bit of Black in you, you would be classified as Black in the US. Now, one thing I want to point out is that the writing style in this book is so good. It's so easy to read. And one of the things that makes it that way is her use of metaphors. So at the onset, like within the first couple chapters, I believe, she compares racism to like this virus that was buried very deep and eventually kind of just comes out, because it's not gone. It may be buried, but it's always lurking beneath the surface. And it's like at some point, like it needs to be dealt with. And I think that's great, because this, or at least I was intimidated by Wilkerson's work, particularly because The Warrant of Other Suns is so massive. And I started with Caste because it is shorter. And it turns out it's very easy to read. I don't think this is gonna take me that long. And the spacing of the words is really not even that much. So far, I'm enjoying this book. I can already tell this is going to be a 5-star read. And I'm looking forward to the next section, which is she's going to talk about the 8 pillars of caste, which she mentioned in the intro, and sort of the 8 characteristics that caste systems all have in common. I'm interested to read that. So that's it for my first update. I'll see you guys soon for my next update on caste. All right, guys, we're back. So I finished parts 3 and 4 since my last update. It's February 11th, so it's been a couple days. I just finished part 4 last night. So I want to talk about my thoughts on these last 2 parts that I've read. And then my next update will be on the remainder of the book, the last 3 parts. Part 3 is all about the 8 pillars of caste. So part 3 is basically each chapter is dedicated to one pillar of caste, as Isabel describes them. And basically what she's done is, based on her study of the 3 main caste systems, so India's caste system, the caste system in the United States based on race, and also Nazi Germany's caste system, she's found these like 8 characteristics that are common amongst all 3 of these caste systems, and she lays each one of those characteristics out in detail. Definitely, in my opinion, I think that this section was the most interesting section. I think it's super neat how she was able to study all 3 of these systems and find these 8 commonalities that existed in all of them. I mean, I can't go into detail on all 8 of them. I strongly encourage that you read the book if you want to learn more about that. Instead, I want to talk about the parts that I found the most interesting. So the pillars that I thought were the most fascinating, if you will. One of them was the act of restricting marriage to only people within your own caste. And she mentioned this in the book. This was so strongly enforced in the United States, where marrying outside of your race was strongly frowned upon. And I think even in present day, like whenever you are with someone that is outside of your race, you kind of still do draw a lot more attention. And one of the reasons that she describes for rules that are so strict on this is because obviously sticking to marriage within your own caste will kind of block any chance of empathy between the 2 castes. And if you want a successful caste system, that's what you want. You don't want the dominant caste empathizing with the lower caste, the subordinate caste. And this is obviously a characteristic within all of the caste systems. So in India, the top caste will definitely not be marrying people that are, untouchables, the outsiders. In America, very, very strict laws against intermarriage going into not that long ago. And actually in some states, it might still actually be illegal. And then in Nazi Germany, separating the Jews from the rest of the country. Another pillar that is super fascinating and that you kind of witness amongst the three caste system is this idea of purity versus pollution. So the people in the dominant caste being what is considered pure, and then there's this like great fear of being polluted by people in the subordinate caste. And this leads to some of the most illogical behavior that she describes in this book. So for example, within the United States, the complete removal of any blacks from swimming pools. And this was so severe, that if someone that was black jumped into a swimming pool, for example, the entire pool was drained and cleaned before any white person would be willing to enter it. And this behavior is like very illogical when you think about it. And it wasn't just water, it's also like air. So like, for example, untouchables, the idea of someone in the high caste, the Brahmins, breathing the same air as the untouchable was very disturbing for them. And this illogical behavior is so ingrained within the caste system that even when people of the dominant caste eventually come to recognize it as being illogical, they can't stop themselves from this behavior, from this kind of thinking that exists or that they've been brought up on. That's kind of how deep that indoctrination runs in regards to caste. And then the third pillar, this isn't like the third pillar, but this is the third pillar that I want to talk about, is the dehumanization of the entire group. And she makes an excellent point in here. It's dehumanization, not of a single person. It has to be the entire group. So for example, we're brought up on stereotypes and beliefs that portray an entire group of people, where in the United States, it's the entire group of African Americans as being a certain way, whether they're all criminals or they're all poor or they're all violent. Tainting an entire group of people in this way, well, it's a process that kind of leads to the dehumanizing of the entire group. And of course, if you dehumanize an entire group, it makes it more okay to treat them with the sort of violence and terror that has been inflicted on people of the lower castes. And probably what struck me the most is in reading this, the punishment that occurred to people in the lower caste for very human responses, right? So like their children being torn away from them and they were not allowed to be sad or cry about that. They had to put on happy faces and pretend like it was all right. That is very not human. That is not a human response to having your children taken away from you. But if you're in the upper caste, you think that no, that's totally fine because they're not really human. Again, if there's anything I take away from this book so far, I mean, I'm not done with the book, but I think that part on all those 8 pillars was probably the most important. And then part 4 was kind of a hodgepodge of how caste infiltrates our daily lives. I think that the material in here was really fascinating. I really like how she talks about her own personal stories as well. I think that that's part of what makes the stories is part of what makes this book so easy to read. Not easy in terms of the content, but easy in terms of like actually reading the book. A couple of the interesting things in part 4 that I want to touch on. The first thing is this fear amongst working class whites who are elevated over the lower caste, basically based only on their skin color, and how this is a group of people that have something to be fearful about when it comes to the dominant caste rising and being successful. And this is something that I remember reading about in Carol Anderson's books. I don't know if it was White Rage or the one about voting, one person, no vote, but she definitely makes this very exact argument how it's the progress of Black people or the elevation of anyone in a lower caste. That is what brings out the most fear in people of the dominant caste. Because if the only thing that you hold over someone is your skin color as they come to rise in society, so if they are smarter or better educated, that threatens you and that threatens your existence. And I feel like that's something that has led to what we're seeing in present day with a lot of the racial unrest that's come to light over the past year. And particularly something that we see in like a Trump America. And the surveillance of Black people that she describes in here. So basically, the need of whites to insert themselves into the everyday lives of Black people, and kind of the overhauling of police on people as they're trying to enter their homes, enter their workplaces, as they're trying to parent their children. All of this being a throwback to kind of Jim Crow era US. The last thing in part 4 that I thought was really fascinating, and I marked that up and I really wanted to talk about it, is this idea of the division within the lower caste. And I think that's something important to talk about, particularly in the United States where we get a lot of immigrants. And having grown up in the Bronx, this is something that I totally saw. So when you get Black immigrants that are coming from Africa or from the Caribbean, they tend to try to build distance between themselves and the subordinate class, which would be considered Black African Americans, so people that are from the United States. And I totally saw this. It's this idea of us versus them in this new country where everyone else will see you all as one group as Black. Now, I think some of it does come to this idea of caste, of trying to distance yourself from a caste that is so stigmatized and has been so dehumanized and has such negative connotations upon it. I don't know if that's the entire story. So, there's obviously, of course, a story of if you are someone that immigrated to the US, you probably just want to make sure that your culture remains alive within your children. So that's also part of it. That's something that she leaves out of here that I think would have been interesting to see. But yeah, this is a phenomenon that you will see if you live in areas where there are lots of immigrants. And I'm really glad she touched on this because that's not an argument that I've seen in some of the other books on race that I've read by like Anderson, for example. All right, so that's where I'm at with this book so far. So that's the end of parts 3 and 4. This has been very, very enjoyable read. I'm super excited to see what she does in wrapping up the rest of this book. And by the way, I am also listening to the audiobook as I go through this book, and the audiobook is fantastic. I'm glad that I waited for it to become available from my library before starting to read this book. All right, guys, welcome to the final portion of this video because I have finished reading Caste. So I finished it last night, parts 5, 6, and 7. And I'm just going to conclude this video with some of my final thoughts from these last 3 parts. First thing I will say about the last 3 parts is I don't feel like there was too many unique points in this last part. I feel like she repeated a lot of the things that she talked about in the earlier parts and kind of reiterated those points. There were a few unique points that I found really interesting that I'm going to bring up, but for the most part, I don't think that there was anything too new or novel in these last couple parts. I'm like talking really strictly. I just had all 4 of my wisdom teeth extracted like 3 days ago. My jaw's still a little stiff. But yeah, some of the things like the point about working class whites being more susceptible to trying to keep caste in place because they greatly benefit from it. She does in these last couple parts get into the Trump-Obama era presidency and how the Obama presidency is not like an indicator that technically racism in the US doesn't exist anymore, especially considering the fact that he didn't win the majority of white voters, and she points that out. And also the Trump presidency in light of caste and how people often argued, and I remember this, couldn't believe that Trump would actually be elected because of how unqualified he was as a candidate. But what people neglected to realize was the fact that in voting for Trump, people were voting in their own interest because they were voting to keep the caste system in place, which is definitely something you can pick up from Trump's messaging, is keeping this caste system in place and this white supremacy in place as well. Now, there was a really, really interesting discussion in these last couple parts in relation to health of lower caste people, and specifically how these lower quality health outcomes, so things like high blood pressure, hypertension, diseases that African Americans and other minorities tend to die from at a much higher rate than their white counterparts, and how that could be directly related or possibly related to the stress of living in a caste system, and how just dealing with the ongoing levels of prejudice your entire life causes so much stress that it can lead to shorter telomeres, and again, that leads to lower life expectancy for these groups of people, particularly when you compare Blacks in America to Blacks in Africa. Which she touches on a little bit in there as well. And what's even more fascinating is that it's the minorities that step out of their caste, so the ones that are maybe getting into the middle to upper class, that suffer the most. So like the more ambitious that these marginalized people are, the more stress they can expect to face, and as a result, the lower a life expectancy they can expect to have. This is a discussion that I have not seen before, and it was very fascinating, and it makes sense. Obviously, I think it would be interesting to read more into this, but just from the initial read through, it makes sense, right? Like, we know stress is bad for you, and anyone that has dealt with discrimination knows that it is very stressful. It's stressful to walk around in a world where you have to be extremely cognizant of your own behavior because of the prejudices that people around you hold about you. And it makes sense that this kind of stress can add up and have a negative effect on your health and your life expectancy. There was a section that I highlighted also on the American versus German response to caste, and how here in the US you kind of see people trying to preserve or honor like Civil War generals with statues and flags and things like that. And just taking these things down is a huge deal here. Whereas in Germany, they have taken the approach of more so honoring the victims of the Holocaust rather than paying tribute to like the Nazi soldiers, for example, and how there's extreme harsh punishment for things like, you know, waving a swastika flag, whereas here you can find Confederate flags on people's trucks, like on the highway. I've seen it, and I live in Seattle. But I kind of like how she keeps coming to this American versus German response, because it is really fascinating to see how and I mean, our caste system, you can say it was in effect far longer than the caste system that was in Germany was in effect for. But you can see just the drastic difference in responses in sort of the aftermath of the two different caste systems. The last thing that she kind of touches on that I found really interesting was the idea of American healthcare, or like our predicament with our healthcare through the lens of caste, and not just healthcare, just social programs in general. And if you're in the US and you're watching this, then you know what I'm talking about. Our healthcare is not great for the vast majority of us. Our health insurance is tied to our employer, and if you don't have an employer that offers health insurance, you probably don't have health insurance, and that means that you can't go to a doctor when you're sick without, you know, it costing so much money that it is basically prohibitive. And, you know, we also know that we are probably one of the kind of top developed nations to not have universal health care for everyone that lives in the country. And the argument that she makes, and I think that this was really interesting, is that because the caste system has been in place in our country for so long, and it's built on a lack of empathy, it means that we have very, very stingy aid for the poor. And really, it's just gotten worse and worse over the decades. And whether it's the poor or the old, yeah, it's true. We don't really have a lot of social aid to help out other members of our society. Our laughable response to the coronavirus pandemic kind of just brought that to the forefront of the entire world, particularly where we see and we see the epidemic kind of affecting minorities at a much higher rate than non-minorities, mostly because those people are also likely to hold these low caste positions, whether it's they're driving buses or delivering packages, those kinds of things. And these are the kind of jobs in America that are less likely to have health care, to have adequate sick time that you feel like you could take it. And so it's the caste system kind of further perpetuating itself. There's a point she makes at the very, very end that I think is really important, and a kind of the perfect way to wrap up this book. And that is the fact that the bottom caste did not create the caste system, and the bottom caste alone cannot fix the caste system. And the need for radical empathy amongst the people in this country. I think that was probably the perfect way to conclude this book, because it kind of wraps up nicely what we hope to expect to see if we want to solve this massive crisis that we have in the US. So those are my thoughts on Caste. Overall, like I said in the beginning, this was an excellent book. I highly recommend it. And particularly just because it was really easy to read. I did have the audiobook along with the physical book for this guy, but I think that it was just for me anyway, it was a new lens to look at our history through in terms of caste, rather than in terms of just pure racism, and very interesting to also compare the caste systems around the world. I'm super glad that I picked this up and read it, and this is like my Black History Month pick. And yeah, if you are thinking about reading this or you have this, I strongly encourage you to do so. It was well worth it. And that's it for this video. I know it's a little bit long from the parts that I've already edited. So if you have made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to me as I've gone through this book with all of my thoughts. And I will see you in the next one.